Physical distancing brings down the number of contacts between people, right? Which reduces the number of people who are getting newly infected, which reduces the number of people who are getting sick, which reduces the number of people who have to be hospitalized, which reduces the number of people who have to be put in the ICU, which reduces the number of people who ultimately have to be put on a ventilator, which ultimately reduces the number of people who have to be buried. Right? It is all one chain of consequences. And the governor is right there to tie that one data point. And may it not be a blip, may it be a start of a steady trend to see the number of ICU beds in California in use drop for the first time since this crisis. Maybe that's, maybe that's something wrong in the data, or maybe that's an accident. But if that is the start, what you can trace it back to is people staying at home. That is why Americans are being told to stay at home, because of that chain of consequences. The only way that you personally can reduce the death toll in your city, in your town, in your county, in your state is by staying at home. And it will matter if you do. That is why it is insane for these holdout Republican governors and legislators to keep saying, well, we don't have that many deaths yet here, so we'll keep waiting and not telling people to stay home. Well, while people are not staying home, human-to-human contact facilitated by people not staying home means there will be more spread of the virus, more infections, more illness, more hospitalizations, more ICU beds, more ventilators used, and more dead. By delaying, even when they've only got a few cases, all they're doing is making their ultimate number of dead citizens larger at the end of the day. With each passing day, they don't keep people at home. It's just that simple. This is not rocket science. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a treatment. All we can do is keep people apart from each other so they stop giving it to more people. That's it. It's the only thing we can do. And if we don't do that, nothing else will matter. It's that simple.